Welcome to this lecture series. This is the first of what are going to be 12, spanning all of 2016. I'd like to, before we actually get started, thank the Brookfield Public Library for hosting us and Stephanie for organizing this. I'd like to thank my wife, Andy, for actually suggesting this idea and helping out with a lot. I'm Greg Sadler. I'm a philosopher by training and by practice. I'm also a longtime fan of fantasy and science fiction literature. That dates back far before I began studying philosophy, to my childhood. And I wear a lot of hats. I'm an author, I'm an educator, public speaker. I produce a lot of educational content. I do management coaching and philosophical counseling. And so, I'm pretty spread out. That's enough about me. I want to give you an overview of what we're doing with the series. So this is actually the third series that Andy and I have done partnering with local libraries. Local used to mean for us New York. We've moved back to Wisconsin, where we were originally from. Andy and I actually met at Waukesha at Catholic Memorial in high school. So we're really happy to be back here. The other two series that we did, one was on existentialism and one was on philosophical approaches to anger, and we partnered with the Kingston Public Library. They were a bit sad to see us go, and we were too, but we're actually very happy to be back here in our home state. So each month, if you notice with the first handout, we're going to examine some of the works of classic and one contemporary, one still very active science fiction or fantasy author. And they're a little bit out of order chronologically, in part because I just wanted to do the particular thinkers or writers in the order that I've got them. I'm going to lecture through quite a bit of this, but feel free at any moment to stop me and ask questions or make comments. It's okay if we digress. That's sort of the way we do things. The central focus of this series is on the worlds that these fantasy or science fiction authors have been able to create imaginatively, and then some of the key philosophical themes that are revealed in them. So, for example, when we talk about Tolkien, we're going to talk about good and evil and the struggle between them. And when we talk about Roger Zelazny and the Chronicles of Amber, we'll talk about Neoplatonist metaphysics, and you'll understand why I'm doing it then, although I'm happy to answer questions about it at that time. We'll probably do a lot of talk about the metaphysics of time and the conundrums that get posed by people going back and forward with certain of them. And the reason I'm bringing philosophy in is to illuminate what's going on in the author's works. It's not just to do philosophy for its own sake. It's rather because by highlighting these themes, I think we can get more out of these. I'll be providing you resources for each session, like handouts. You notice I've given you a packet there. We video record each session, so if you miss one and you're interested in that sort of thing, you can always check it out on YouTube. I'm considering, but not promising yet, to host it on a website that would be devoted to this series in particular. And we'll probably circulate an email list too, right, if people want notifications about that. So now this session itself, what I wanted to talk about, first I'm going to indulge myself a little bit, which I won't usually do, in talking about my motivations for doing the series in the first place. And then I'd like to talk a bit about these two fictional genres, science fiction and fantasy, in their development and how people distinguish them from each other. And then we'll bring in some philosophy and talk about the relationship between philosophy and these genres of fiction, and some of the areas of philosophy and how they might apply here. And then we'll come back and talk about certain recurring dimensions of narrative, and with a special attention to world, or what they call world building in fiction. And then we'll just do any sort of discussion or Q&A and any wrap-up that we need to do. So my motivations for this, like I said, we've done previous year-long lecture series that went very well and had sort of a large following after a while with the Kingston Library. And I wanted to, well, Andy and I both wanted to build a similar community of ongoing discussions and inquiry here in the Milwaukee area, and Brookfield was the library that stepped up and said they would like to do that. Now, for me, as a practicing philosopher, I don't usually read science fiction and fantasy as part of my job. That's guilty pleasure reading. And I sneak it in when I can. So given an opportunity to get to read it, because I actually have to, that's really great for me. So that's part of why I wanted to do this particular series. And myself, like I said, I've been a fan of fantasy and science fiction since I was a kid. That's part of why it's guilty pleasure reading. You get to do a lot more, pleasure reading when you're younger than when you're older is my experience. But I got introduced to a lot of philosophical ideas and literature myself through the medium of fantasy and science fiction. So I wanted to revisit some of that and see what I could do with it. I'll also tell you a story about a friend of mine, a colleague up at St. Anselm College, just bearing on philosophy and literature. He's about 20 years older than me, and he went to college in California. And at that time, what they were doing in philosophy was primarily what you call analytic philosophy, a lot of logic chopping and attention to language, and it didn't seem very interesting to him. He took a few philosophy classes, and he was like, yeah, I definitely don't want to do that. And then he discovered Plato. And somebody, I think, handed him a copy of Plato's Dialogues, and he started reading the stuff, and he said, this is philosophy? This literature here? They were exploring great ideas, but there were characters, there was something going on, there was a stake, for instance, Socrates dies, that's giving away the story at one point. That helped him to sort of grasp that philosophy could be something really interesting, something vital. And I think that it works that way with a lot of literature. If you think about, existentialism and the entire movement there, many of the great existentialist authors would not only write big, thick philosophy books, they would write novels, or they would write plays, or they would write poetry even. So that's sort of a long-winded explanation of why I wanted to revisit classic fiction and science fiction and fantasy in this series. Now, when we look at fictional genres in their development, we're talking about these two overarching categories. And you know where they are in the library, yeah.
You mentioned the word genres
yeah.
twice, and excuse my ignorance, but I never heard those terms before, and can you define what that means?
Well, I can't define it. Most things are actually very difficult to define adequately. But what I can say is a genre is usually thought of as a sort of type or family of literature. So if we talk about romance novels, that's a genre. Or we talk about mercenary novels or memoirs or things like that.
How do you spell it?
Genre? Genre. I'm a very bad speller, actually. Those videos that I have where I'm in front of a chalkboard, sometimes I misspell things. Yeah. Now, we know where to find them in the library, or if you go into a bookstore. So, of course, they must be different from each other, because otherwise there wouldn't be something filed here and something filed there. But then when we have to stop and think about it, well, what actually separates one from the other, things start to get rather murky. And so what we're going to try to work towards, and what I've given you a second handout about, is the distinction between those. Before that, I'd like to talk a little bit about some historical background. When we're thinking about fantasy, the way some people define fantasy literature, it encompasses, mythology, and so it would go back as far as human beings have been writing things down. Some of the earliest things that we have written are either mythological accounts, like the Enuma Elish in Babylonian literature, or they tend to be things like who owes somebody for these barrels of beer, those sorts of documents, or political documents. The king says this or that. So it's really integral, this fantasizing component to human cultures. We probably want to get a little bit more specific than just saying anything where somebody's imagining things is fantasy, though. So if we look back to the ancient period, we can find imaginative literature of various sorts. There's a really interesting work by a guy named Lucian of Samosata, who was originally Syrian and then came to Greece. It's called The True History. And it's called The True History because there's nothing true whatsoever in it, and he's making fun of historians who would smuggle in all sorts of crazy stuff into their things. And it's seen as either the first fantasy novel or the first science fiction novel. It has some science fiction elements like travel to the moon, interstellar warfare, meeting alien beings and then describing them. It also has some pretty fantastic elements, like getting swallowed up by a whale and living inside of it for quite a long time. A sea of milk that they would sail on, the island of the blessed. So it's kind of got elements of both. Another work too that you find around the same time is called The Golden Ass, and it's by a guy called Apuleius. And that one has a lot of fantasy elements in it because you have a guy who gets transformed into an ass and then goes through all sorts of other adventures, mostly motivated by amorous intent. But he has all sorts of interesting experiences. And so when we look back on the genres, a lot of people want to say those are some of the starting points. We also have a lot of literature throughout history that could be said to range into the realm of the fantastic. Think about if those of you who have read Beowulf. You have Grendel, who's clearly not a normal kind of foe. Grendel's mom, who's even worse than Grendel. It ends with a dragon, and yet it's also got some very stark, realistic depictions of things as well. So Beowulf, it's not coincidental too that Beowulf is brought up. Tolkien himself wrote a lot about Beowulf because Tolkien was a scholar who worked with languages. What about science fiction? We don't see a lot of science fiction in, say, medieval literature. And why not? Well, in part because you need technology, and you need to be thinking about technology in a certain way, or the advance of science, in order to get science fiction. We do see a lot of that in the modern period. Great example of an early work along those lines would be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Those of you who've read that, you see a lot of science fiction elements. Also elements of another closely related genre, that of horror, which we're not going to talk about too much in this, although I did try to smuggle Lovecraft into the series, but I couldn't find a spot for him, although I would have loved to have done so. Now, there's a lot of sources about that those who would write important works in fantasy or science fiction would draw upon. Some of it was engagement with previous literature. Some of the great science fiction and fantasy authors have read everybody. And when they tell people how to write, that's often their advice. Read everybody you can. And read the really good stuff. Don't just read a bunch of other sci-fi authors. Read Shakespeare. Read epic poetry. Read humanistic literature. They also were sometimes involved in philosophical or other cultural movements. Mary Shelley was involved in the Romantic movement, which wasn't just about, romance novels. That's actually sort of a spin-off of that. It had a whole philosophical underpinning, a sort of scientific attitude that we call positivism was underlying a lot of science fiction literature. You can see that very clearly in, say, H.G. Wells, but even more in people like A.E. Van Vogt, who we're going to look at. Social and cultural changes were having an impact. Also, the growing incorporation of technology into our lives, something that we take for granted because we've been living in a technologized environment longer than any of us have been around. Our ancestors grew up with a lot of technology surrounding them, and we have, look at this thing, just think about the cell phone and what that's capable of. that wasn't something that previous ages had. And thinking about how technology intervenes in our life and how it penetrates things would lead some of these authors to conceive their worlds. Philip Dick is a great example of that. C.S. Lewis is a great example of somebody who's not really happy about that in this hideous strength, one of the books that we'll look at. So all of that's historical stuff. When we think about these genres of fantasy and science fiction, often people like to blur them together and place them under the rubric of speculative fiction, a much broader tent that includes other things like alternate history or horror or magical realism, that sort of stuff. I don't know that it's that helpful just to talk of speculative fiction because it gets so vague. The question that we want to pose ourselves then, and that I've created this handout for you about, is can we, rigorously distinguish science fiction and fantasy apart from each other, and not even worrying about other genres like horror or other stuff. And I gave you 3 quotes to start with that seem very, very promising. Asimov. If we're going to, think about somebody who knows something about this, presumably Asimov would, right? Since he's writing it. He says, science fiction, given its grounding in science, is possible. Fantasy, which has no grounding in reality, is not. You know which side of the fence he's falling on there, right? And another one that's kind of similar, Rod Serling, you know from the Twilight Zone, but who had a lot of other interests. He says, it's been said science fiction and fantasy are 2 different things. Science fiction, the improbable made possible. Fantasy, the impossible made probable. There we're talking about what we call modalities, probability, possibility. It may be difficult when you first read it to imagine exactly what they have in mind, but when you think about it, the improbable made possible, right? So science fiction is taking things like, for example, you would have an entire computer at your fingertips. That seemed kind of improbable, 40 years ago. And you could write a science fiction story in which this is the case. Fantasy, the impossible made probable. Magic, that's a major component in a lot of fantasy things. Made probable, made into something that could be thought through. If you grant this impossible assumption at the start, then these things would follow. That's how Serling is parsing these out. Sawyer wrote, there's discontinuity between our reality and fantasy, and with science fiction, there's a continuity between our reality and science fiction. Another way of saying the same things. Now, there's some problems with this, though, and I don't want to necessarily try to solve this tonight, but I just want you to be aware of this. 2 guys that are pretty clearly science fiction don't fit in that well with this reading of probability and possibility. This guy, Jorge Luis Borges, often associated with magical realism, he made a distinction between them, saying Verne's stories deal with probable things. So he's just extrapolating from the present and, figuring out what are things going to be like 10 years, 20 years from now. Wells' stories concern just possibilities, if not impossible things, like an invisible man, or a flower that eats people, or a crystal egg that reflects the events on Mars. Something, by the way, is just a sideline, that crystal egg that reflects the events on Mars, something very similar in Lucian's True History. Up on the moon, there's a mirror that reflects what's happening down on Earth. So that device had already been imagined back in the 2nd century. Another problem is raised by Arthur Clarke, great author himself in these genres. He articulated these 3 laws, kind of jokingly, and we're really interested in the 2nd and the 3rd. The only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. Our notion of possibility and impossibility turns out to be provisional. And so it's not enough to allow us to draw a rigorous distinction. The next one kind of really puts the end to it. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If that's granted, then the distinction between science fiction and fantasy really breaks down. Another challenge would be the fact that there actually is a subgenre called science fantasy. And some of the examples of that would be the completed Chanter series, C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, which we'll look at in a few months. H.P. Lovecraft stories would fit in there. So I'm not actually going to go over the fourth challenge. But the point that I want to make here is maybe we don't, after having gone around the course, maybe what we learn is that we don't actually have to try to rigorously distinguish between fantasy and science fiction. There may be some things that are very easily identifiable as science fiction, others that are very easily identifiable as fantasy, but there's probably a messy interplay between them where it's harder to distinguish. For example, the Dune series of books, are they science fiction or are they fantasy? Well, they're in space, so that makes you think it's got to be science fiction, but there's also a very strong rejection of technology in them on the part of the people who live there, and some things that seem kind of magical, so that makes it seem a bit like fantasy. Maybe we don't have to decide one way or the other. Now, when we get to that point, if you've followed this so far, congratulations, you've been doing some philosophy. One of the things that we do in philosophy, I smuggled some in by the back door, is try to define things like you were asking for and see if we can distinguish between them rigorously or if we can't. That's one of the things that you'll see in a lot of philosophical classes and activities. It's not as if philosophy has a market on that. People do that in literature, people do that in history, people do that in all sorts of the humanities, but it's pretty common there. Before I go on, any questions or comments, or we'll take a little mind break before plowing on.
Well, I like your idea of the golden ass, because we're going to see him tonight when we watch the debates.
Well, you may see more than one.
Yes. A number.
He ends up getting turned into one, and then I think he takes a couple other forms as well in the course of the story. It's really quite. Have you ever read it? It's very funny.
No, I haven't.
Oh yeah, it's one of they also call it one of the first picaresque novels. The picaresque is a genre where you have these episodes and people get into adventure after adventure after adventure, and instead of having like the typical plot where you have a build and a climax and then a denouement. Yeah, it just goes up and down and up and down. And you can add it's great for serial things because you can just keep adding more episodes. So long as you don't kill the character, you're okay. Well, let's talk now a little bit more about philosophy explicitly. So, how many of you have had a philosophy class somewhere along the line, like an intro to philosophy or ethics? Okay, so most of you. So most of you have had some experience, some contact with academic philosophy. What we're going to do here is less connected with that. I think there's two ways of thinking about philosophy that are not particularly helpful. One of them is to identify philosophy with contemporary academic philosophy, in part because the way philosophy gets taught in many philosophy departments is very removed from the historical literature and the discipline of philosophy. And that might have turned some people off when they took their intro class or whatever other class. I hear that a lot from people. They thought they were going to read some Plato, and instead they just saw the guy at the board putting some logic things up there and then took a test. We're not going to do that sort of thing. The other thing that we want to avoid is thinking about philosophy as just a general approach that a person has, like when a person says, our philosophy of business is to keep the customer satisfied. That's not quite so rigorous as philosophy. Philosophy can be understood as a number of different things, and it's helpful to have these in mind rather than trying to identify it strictly with one of them. One is an intellectual activity that's often carried out through dialogue, not just by sitting by oneself in a chair off in one's room. It's also a discipline that we can teach or study. Many people thought of philosophies as ways of life, and a lot of ancient and medieval philosophy is oriented around this idea of philosophy as a way of life. You can also think of it as the actual teachings, the systems of doctrines, and it's a canon of literature as well. So, if you go to the, is this library laid out in Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress? Okay, so the 100s, with some exceptions, you want philosophy stuff, there you go, there's the literature, right? Philosophy is all these things. So, we don't have to pin it down on each of them. What I do want to say is that there's a long history of those who were writing the kind of literature that we're looking at, having studied philosophy and having engaged other people in discussions about philosophy. Tolkien, Lewis, Van Vogt, all of these guys are great examples of that. Philip K. Dick especially, who we're going to look at later on. Now, philosophy can enter into or appear in fictional works in quite a few ways. Given what you know about philosophy, and I'm guessing that all of you have read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, or just maybe you're not as big on fantasy, but on science fiction. Where would you see philosophy, in your experience, entering into these stories? Where have you encountered it? Does anything come to mind? How so?
Well, I think that there's a lot of theories about what Aslan is meant to represent.
Oh, yeah.
The first one, for example,
Yeah.
there's a sense of questioning what the characters should do or ought to do compared to what their
So
impulses
ethics.
are to do. Yeah.
Yeah. With the cautionary tales, don't be like Edmund.
Yeah,
You know.
exactly. That might be one area.
Okay. Now they don't actually say let's philosophize about this, but they do
It's not
engage.
explicit,
Yeah, they engage in some moral reasoning. Any other things that come to
Children's
mind?
books, have a lot of philosophy in terms of these creatures that can speak and think and.
Yeah, what would it be like for an otter to actually
Right.
think about things? Would it be like a human being?
Yeah, I
or
just
not?
read a book about it's a dog's life, and you get the dog's view of everything, and it's the funniest book, and it's great.
Yeah.
It's just because this is a French dog, and he learns to live with snobs after having a very rough beginning,
Yeah.
and then he makes fun of these people when they have parties in his mind.
Another example would be, I forgot the name of the title of the book, but it was about a fellow going to the zoo and visiting the cage of a gorilla, and between the two of them, they were having a mental conversation between each other. It was fascinating.
Okay. The whole Dr. Dolittle, now that I think about it, which are really children's literature, but they're essentially fantasy literature. The animals have different perspectives on things, and they articulate them and argue with each other about what ought to be done. Usually, though, they're in more agreement than the people are in the books, now that I remember. Well, let me give you some things to think about. Sometimes philosophy is explicitly mentioned or referred to in the narration or in the dialogue. Philip Dick is a great example of that. When you read his novels, he will pepper you with all sorts of references to Kant or Anselm's ontological argument. Sometimes he's just playing around with it, and it's not that he's getting it wrong, it's rather that he's using it for a different purpose. And so if you're a real stickler about it, you say, well, you got the argument wrong. But no, it fits into the narrative somehow. Sometimes there's invention and elaboration of philosophies or whole perspectives within the worldview. When you think about Ursula K. Le Guin's stories, she will create entire philosophies within them. Sometimes there's concepts or themes, like you were talking about, which fit into philosophy, and they're not explicitly set out like that. But if you know the philosophy, you can say, aha, that's what's going on there. Roger Zelazny, in his Chronicles of Amber, the way that he describes the relationship between Amber and all the other realities, all the other planes of existence, is something that's very similar to the understanding of being itself in Neoplatonism. And so we'll talk a bit about that when we get to him. And sometimes there's philosophical arguments in these things, clashes between positions. C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, you have people who actually represent different philosophies arguing with each other about what's right and wrong or what's true or false. Sometimes I think that philosophical ideas can be better understood or worked through or represented through the medium of literature. I'm sort of in the minority, I think, among philosophers in thinking that, but I'm in good company. Plato thought that, otherwise he wouldn't have written dialogues. The existentialists thought that, or else they wouldn't have written plays. Now, the good question then is, well, why would it be the case that sometimes we can think through ideas better in a narrative form? And the way that some people look at it is, well, you know, there's conceptual thinking, and that's for smart people, and then there's narrative, you know, picture thinking, and that's for everybody else, the great unwashed masses. And so we have philosophy up on high for the elite that can do it, and then everyone else needs to be told a story. And I would like to reject that point of view and say that that's actually a narrative by itself. So the people who have that aren't realizing they're telling a story themselves in which they're, of course, the heroes. But I think that it downplays a lot of why stories appeal to us so much. And I think we can take a cue from the existentialists. You know, so I'm thinking about people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and Friedrich Nietzsche. They center on the individual person and their experiences and their life as a locus for philosophy. Now, why do that? There's certain ideas that probably aren't as gripping in the abstract when you're considering them, and this doesn't have to even be for philosophy. Think about personal finance. You know, when you're told as a kid about keeping tallies of how much you're spending, and you have an allowance and you have parents, it doesn't really matter to you, right? You don't have to keep track of all that stuff. And then you get your own apartment and your own car and your job, and you have a checkbook or a Quicken or whatever, and now suddenly it's driven home to you just how important that idea of there should be more in this column than in this column, you know, intake versus outgo, it makes more sense. Right? There's a lot of ideas like that, I think. Think about, you know, the whole organization of a library. I'm sure you could tell us a lot about why these classification systems that we have actually do make sense when people don't think that they make particular sense. There's a lot that we learn by being within a story. And what these authors allow us is an entrance into the stories that they're telling us. So maybe there's some ideas that in order to be more fully understood really need to be set in a narrative mode. That's what I'm going to try to work with here. So the upshot of this would be that examining philosophical themes in science fiction and fantasy wouldn't be just this abstract artificial activity. It would actually kind of flow naturally out of the act of reading and discussing things. So I've given you a handout here. Yeah.
Perhaps one idea that comes to my mind, the reason why you want to embody an idea is also when you read, it's not just your rational mind that's engaged, right? You also engage your emotions. And one, for example, if the story is emotional, and then if you engage your emotions, it tends to appeal to other spheres of life. And that's
very true.
That's why it may be, easier to think about certain things, or that's why the story is more lively or more engaging.
You know, George R. R. Martin, the last person that we're going to look at, the one contemporary writer, when he's done a lot of interviews, and he usually says the same stuff in all his interviews, which is good because it means he's consistent, right? He's not just making it up as he goes along. And he said at a certain point, I'm really loosely paraphrasing here, that for the writer, it's not so important to think about what genre they're writing in. You could be doing horror, you could be doing sci-fi, you could be doing fantasy, you could be doing whatever you want. But what really matters is whether you can handle emotions well. Because if you If you can't produce emotions by your writing, it doesn't matter what you're writing. It's not going to grip people. I mean, unless you're doing like technical writing or something like that. For narrative stuff, you have to somehow be able to produce emotions in your audience, and so your characters have to experience emotions. There have to be ways of telling things that are going to steer them this way or that way. And you also don't want it. He said you also don't want it to be just sort of, what would we call it? Kind of maudlin, easy emotions. You want things like think about.
Like the plague.
Oh, you mean Camus' The
Yes,
Plague? Yeah.
Right. So that there's a lot of emotion. That's why I think thinking of existentialism is much easier once you get into the story and you're really perturbed by what's going on.
Yeah.
You can imagine, how would you feel in that situation?
There's in one of the handouts that I've got some excerpts from writings about fantasy and science fiction by science fiction and fantasy authors, and one is Michael Moorcock, and it's from an essay about why Philip K. Dick is so good. In that essay, he explicitly brings up Camus' The Plague and a couple other existentialist writings as models that science fiction authors ought to be emulating. And he says that Dick was really good at doing that sort of thing without ever calling any attention to his connections. But good magician, you don't see the thing in the sleeve. The handout that I've given you here is areas of philosophy, areas and disciplines in philosophy. And these aren't all of them, but these are 6 of the big ones. And if you look at those sort of questions that they're concerned with, you can see that there's a lot of connections between what's discussed or what happens within a science fiction or fantasy novel and these sorts of issues. What is time? How does time work? Those are metaphysical questions. What caused what? Or what typically causes what? That's a metaphysical question. As a matter of fact, I should probably just go through these and give you like sort of thumbnail things. Epistemology, how do we know anything? Who's reliable and who isn't? Think about how many stories there are where the telling of the story involves figuring out who's lying to you and who's actually truthful. Those are epistemological questions. Detective stories, by definition, are exercises in epistemology. Logic and argumentation. So the logic by itself, not quite so much, but people are making arguments all the time in those. Ethics and moral philosophy, the question of what's right, what's wrong, what's right in this situation, even though it seems to be wrong in most situations. Those are ethical questions. Social and political philosophy. Who should be running the show? Who should be in charge and who should be obeying them? Should it just be a matter of whoever's got the guns rules? Or should we have other criteria for how to organize the society? Those are political questions on a fundamental level, and those are dealt with in political and social philosophy. Aesthetics or philosophy of art. What's beautiful? What's ugly? What makes it beautiful? What makes it ugly? What if that guy over there thinks that what I think is beautiful is ugly? How do we adjudicate, or do we just punch each other in the nose and tell each other off? Those are aesthetic questions. These enter into science fiction and fantasy novels in very important ways. So you can see there's a lot of room for looking at philosophical themes in this stuff. Any questions or other comments before I go into the stuff about narrative and world building? Just to keep this on. I don't want to take up too much time with this. Should I just go straight into it then? Okay, so, I think all of you remember as kids having to do book reports, right? Do they still do, you're young enough that you would know, do they still make you do book reports at all? Okay, and is it all like, what's the theme, who are the characters, it's very formulaic sort of thing? The reason why they did that was it was a very bad way of trying to get across to you some of the basic elements of storytelling. And it probably turned you off, it turned me off terribly. to have to go through this very schematic process. But really what they were trying to do is get you attuned to differentiating between certain key elements. Differentiating between, say, a plot and a theme. Thinking about the role of characters. And this is not something totally new. Aristotle, in writing a book called the Poetics, which was about dramatic poetry, like, plays, tragedies, and comedies, he did something similar to that. He distinguished 6 elements of them. And when you hear, I'll read you the Greek names, and then I'll tell you what they actually mean. And when you hear them, you're going to say, oh yeah, that's sort of along the same lines. There's mythos. Mythos means plot or story. Ethos, that means character. Dianoia is a very fancy word for thinking about stuff. But thinking about stuff in such a way that you actually communicate it to other people. That's dialogue, right? That's explanations of what you're doing. Lexis, that's harder to translate. It's something like style or word choice. Sometimes we talk about mood, when an author creates a mood. Melos, we don't have this in literature, but this plays an important role in things like film. It means music or song, at least in that context. And then finally, opsis. Opsis means what you see with your eyes, the spectacle. Now, can an author bring in music in a certain way into their works? I think so. What about spectacle? Do they bring things before your eyes? If they're writing well, they do. So those are basic categories. We more often talk about character, and we talk about tone or style. We talk about dialogue. We talk about plot. What else do we usually hit on that's important that Aristotle would have left out of his list? Think back to your book reports and the things you had to fill out. The blank of this book is blah, blah, blah.
The theme?
That's very important, yeah. So what is the difference between a theme and a plot? Does anyone remember offhand? This is important for what we're going to do in the series. It's so a plot is the actual story, right? If we pick Romeo and Juliet, Romeo would like to go out with Juliet. Juliet would like to go out with Romeo. Their parents disagree. There's a plot, right? The theme is something bigger.
Oh, yeah, it's called love.
Well, not just
In
love.
that particular love.
What about that kind of love? What would you, if you had to?
Tragic love.
Very good. Yeah,
Tragedy.
yeah. Love that can't realize itself. There's different ways of framing it, and it's not as if one is more right than the other. But you notice you got a grand theme, and there could be all sorts of other things. What was that musical that's a repeat of Romeo and Juliet that everyone used to? West Side Story. Okay, West Side Story. It really is pretty much a similar plot, isn't it? Although the names are different, and it's the same theme, the exact same theme. And we can say similar things about many other stories, and we can talk about the stories that are in here as well. What else do we usually hit on in book reports? Another two key elements of narrative.
The moral of the story.
Yeah, now sometimes that's the theme, and sometimes it's something different. Yeah, and some stories, you wonder if they do have a moral. That's one of the big complaints about George R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, is that the moral seems to be something like, never get attached to a character, because he's going to kill them off. Everyone dies. It's an open question at this point, because he hasn't finished the last 2 books. Certainly seems pretty dark. What about the saga of Middle Earth? Is there a overarching moral to the story? Maybe there's multiple morals to the story. Don't trust white wizards. If the Dark Lord suggests something to you for gaining power, it's probably too good to be true. Things like that. What about setting? That's another really key dimension, isn't it? And Aristotle didn't worry about setting because you know what the setting of any given play is. It's up there on stage. And they didn't even have decorations at that time. It was just, it's pretty basic. What we nowadays call minimalist. Now if you want to see a play like that, you have to go to people who really work to take the things off the stage, right? But in a story, setting is incredibly important. And if we're thinking about this conception of worlds of fantasy and science fiction, setting is really what we're taking our cue from. What is the setting? It's the where and the when, and the time and the place. But it's more than that, isn't it? What else does setting usually include for us?
It sets the mood.
That's very important, yeah. Is it a dark world? Is it a world of light? Is it a world of contrasts?
Well, the environment focuses. It helps you focus in on an element of it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to put it in words.
Sometimes the environment actually becomes a major part of the plot, like in the Dune books, for example, where you have people who are planetologists and are interested in figuring out why this planet is the way that it is, what kind of setting it is. So let's talk about world building then. So every literature generates some sort of relations to the world of the author for the reader. Otherwise, you can't be sucked in. And if it's unsuccessful, you don't believe the world. It's or it bores you. That may actually be a better index. Not whether it's believable, but whether you find it interesting at all. Whether you put the book down and say, I'm not going to bother with this. Now, worlds seem to be primarily matters of determinate settings and settling on conditions. So if we think about fantasy, for example, does magic work? That's a big key thing you have to figure out if you wanted to write a fantasy novel. And if magic works, what kind of magic? Is it something complicated? Is it something just mysterious? Different fantasy writers have dealt with this in different ways. Some fantasy writers actually have worlds where there is no magic. Mervyn Peake is a great example of this with his Gormenghast trilogy. There isn't any magic in that, as far as I remember, but it's considered a fantasy novel. Instead, there's other things going on. Another key thing for science fiction, what technological advances have been made? Consider, for example, space travel. Now, what's the one thing that really holds us back from science fiction universes besides the fact that we don't have spaceships and we haven't settled a lot of political problems here at home? What separates us from most of those fantasy worlds that we see, say, in movies and TV?
Distance.
Yeah. Now how?
It's vast.
Yeah. So we, at this point in time, we're pretty well convinced we can't travel faster than the speed of light. It's pretty routinely done in science fiction, though, isn't it? Why? Because if you don't do it, then it takes an awfully long time. Yeah. I mean, you can't have space battles if the ships would have to take, 60 years to get there. There is a whole genre. What's that?
They can't get into the wormhole.
Yeah, well, that's one way to solve it. You have a wormhole, or, they have a whole bunch of. I actually looked at a Wikipedia entry, a broader thing. About hyperspace, right? There's all different words that science fiction people have come up with. For it's a warp drive, it's a hyperdrive, it's a starburst, it's a this and that. They're all ways of using something that you build into the world to make sense out of how you would overcome a narrative problem. Namely, the fact that you want worlds to be connected with each other. You could think of it the same way. Imagine if you had a fantasy world in which there were a whole bunch of different places, and they had almost impenetrable mountains that took you 60 years to cross to get from one side to the other. Wouldn't be much of a story, would it? So you have to have ways to get from one place to another. That's part of your setting. That's part of your world building. Worlds also involve metaphysical questions, like possibility or impossibility. What's possible and what's impossible in that world? What's real versus what's apparent? Are people free or are they determined? How does time and space work? There's epistemological dimensions, concerns with knowledge and truth and doubts, sorting out who's reliable, who's not. The question of whether a false story has been told about, the origin of this group over here. That's an epistemological question. Worlds have social dimensions and moral dimensions. There's always some sort of societies, politics, religion. Sometimes if authors really want to get technical, they'll go into talk about the economics of things. Characters face moral choices. They come into conflicts over that sort of stuff. Another thing I would like to say too about world building is a really good world is going to be a composite of a whole bunch of different plots. So you're going to have the plot that's happening in the world at that time. And then there's going to be references to all sorts of other stories that aren't happening now, but happened before. You see this in Tolkien. You see this in George R.R. Martin. You see this in quite a few of these other authors who we're looking at. And so we can think of the worlds as something that is revealed to us gradually, that we're invited to enter into, that has a lot of philosophical dimensions to it that we can explore. And oftentimes we don't get a full picture of it in the first book. Smart authors do that sort of thing because they keep you, having to come back and buying another book. Or perhaps it's also because they didn't have it fully worked out at that time. Now, I have a couple really interesting, at least I think they're interesting, quotations about worlds by some of the key authors that we're going to look at. And not just worlds, but fantasy and science fiction in general. First is Tolkien. And he says, fantasy starts out with an advantage, arresting strangeness, but that advantage has been turned against it and has contributed to its disrepute. Many people dislike being arrested. They dislike any meddling with the primary world. He calls this that we live in the primary world, or such small glimpses of it as are familiar to them. Fantasy also has another essential drawback. It's difficult to achieve. Fantasy may be, as I think, not less, but more sub-creative, but at any rate, it's found in practice that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce. The more unlike are the images and the rearrangements of primary material to the actual arrangements of the primary world. So the more that we have to go away from where we live now, the more difficult it is to pull off. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will require labor and thought, and will certainly require a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed narrative art, story making in its primary and most potent mode. So he's describing what he does there. He was one of the people who could pull that off. But he's also talking about what other people before him have done, and I think he's giving us a model for what some of these other great, successful science fiction writers and fantasy writers have done. Think about, again, Frank Herbert and his creation of this whole, Dune universe. Quite amazing stuff there that he was able to do. He was doing exactly what Tolkien is describing there. The next one is from Ursula K. Le Guin, and it's from an essay called From Elfland to Poughkeepsie. Now this is very interesting because she's talking about language and the kind of language that people ought to use. And she says, many readers, many critics, and most editors speak of style as if it was an ingredient to the book, like sugar in a cake, or something added onto the book, like the frosting on the cake. The style, of course, is the book. If you remove the cake, all you have left is a recipe. If you remove the style, all you have left is a synopsis of the plot. This is partly true of history, largely true of fiction, absolutely true of fantasy. So she's saying without this element of style, you don't have fantasy at all. And then she says, why is it of such fundamental significance in fantasy? This is a really important point. It's important in fantasy because there's nothing but the writer's vision of the world. There's no borrowed reality of history or current events or just plain folks at Peyton Place. There's no comfortable matrix of the commonplace to substitute for the imagination, to provide ready-made emotional response, to go to the emotional issue, and to disguise flaws and failures of creation. There's only a construct built in a void, with every joint and seam and nail exposed. Here we go. To create what Tolkien calls the secondary universe is to make a new world, a world where no voice has ever spoken before, where the act of speech is the act of creation. The only voice that speaks there is the creator's voice, and every word counts. So she's building off of what Tolkien is saying, and saying it doesn't just require, sort of thinking things through. You also have to have some developed style, or you can't pull it off. The next one that I have is from Michael Moorcock, who we're going to look at in terms of his Cornelius Chronicles. Moorcock, by the way, liked to see himself as the anti-Tolkien. He had some very nasty things to say about Tolkien in some of his interviews and writings. But he really liked Philip K. Dick, another person we're going to look at. And Dick, he says, Dick writes without pretension. He's not out there to impress. There's no virtuoso display in Dick's works. His characters are exceptionally easy to identify with, and they're convincing. They're almost always ordinary people, with ordinary in quotes, even if they happen to possess side powers, as many of them do. And while their personalities don't impress us, they're exactly the right kind of characters needed to convince us of the reality of their universe. Their problems are ordinary problems to do with sex, money, and prestige, and it's these problems that tend to lead them into the bigger issues involving the fate of many, what we call the political or the social dimension. In virtually all of his novels, Dick is interested primarily in the workings of the human mind and how these relate to the world in general. So he says, what his work does have is a seriousness of purpose and unfaltering intention to get at the truth as Dick sees it, the power to create everyday environments which gradually shift in perspective until every aspect of the particular environment is held in question. The same is done with character. A man may begin by feeling he knows himself, but gradually Dick will whittle away at that belief, leaving the man totally unsure even that he exists. Dick uses all the skill of an excellent science fiction craftsman to produce books which are more than just craftsmanly pieces of escapism. So he's highlighting two other dimensions, character and conflict. How you get the world to be called into question. What kind of world is it that we live in? Who knows? Sometimes we have to figure that out. Finally, we have George R. Martin. And Martin, this is a very famous analogy that he makes. He says, there's many kinds of writers. I like to use the analogy of architects and gardeners. And he says Tolkien is an architect. He's a prime example. Architects plan everything, they blueprint everything, they know before they drive the first nail into the first board what the house is going to look like, where all the closets are going to be, where the plumbing is going to run. Everything is figured out in the blueprints before they begin any work whatsoever. Then there are gardeners who dig a little hole and drop a seed in, and then water it with their blood and see what comes up and what sort of shape it is. They know what sort of seed they've planted, whether it's an oak or an elm or a horror story or a science fiction story, but they don't know how big it's going to be or what shape it's going to take. I'm more of a gardener than an architect, he says. And he says this about his characters. When he creates his characters, he doesn't know what's going to happen to them. He knows they're going to get into fights with each other, but that's pretty much about it. He doesn't know which ones are going to die from the start. But that's another way to look at world creation. And then he says, here's his criticism of Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings, he says, is the mountain that leans over every other fantasy written since and shaped all modern fantasy. But there's things about it, the whole concept of the Dark Lord and good guys battling bad guys, good versus evil, while brilliantly handled in Tolkien, in the hands of many Tolkien successors, it's become a kind of cartoon. It's certainly a genuine, legitimate topic as the core of fantasy, but I think the battle between good and evil is waged within the individual human hearts. That's Martin. That's part of why his stories are rather ambiguous about who's a good guy, who's a bad guy. Now, all of these reveal to us certain dimensions of world making by people who are telling us about their own craft. All of these have philosophical dimensions to them. They're about metaphysics or epistemology or ethics and what role it has to play. So what I wanted to do with this talk was just sort of set the scene for the ones to come after this. monthly. That's pretty much all the material that I have. I'm happy to have any sort of discussion that we'd like to have about these matters, or entertain any challenges, or answer any questions, clarifications. So who would like to start?
I got a question.
Sure.
Historically, philosophy and physics and science were just one to start with.
A long time ago, yeah.
At that time, the philosophy pretty much guided Nazareth's thoughts, thinking in the development of science, especially physics.
Yeah.
What about today?
Well, that's a great question. So there's a couple things to say about that. One is philosophy and the natural sciences parted ways, you could say, definitively in the 19th century. I mean, before that, sometimes they were called natural philosophy. There was a lot of communication back and forth. And I don't want to say that they're totally cut off from each other. But there was this philosophical movement that was very closely tied to science called positivism. And the idea was that, sort of giving a thumbnail sketch of it, there was a historical dimension where you have theological treatments of things, then you have metaphysical treatments. Theological, you believe in gods or spirits or whatever. Metaphysical, you believe in forces, but it's hard to explain them. And then you have the positivist way of looking at things. Just science. Science will solve everything. Science has all the answers. Anything that science can't answer is stupid and a waste of time and all that. That was, again, a little bit of exaggeration there on my part, but if you have that sort of mindset, then you very easily end up saying things like Neil deGrasse Tyson said recently about philosophy, it's a total waste of time, or Stephen Hawking says similar things as well. And then when you call upon them to explain why they think philosophy is a waste of time, almost always they end up lapsing into philosophy and trying to make arguments that are essentially philosophical arguments going way beyond physics or whatever. The other part of the story, so I said the natural sciences spun out of philosophy and then became independent. There's also the social sciences. So anthropology, psychology, economics, sociology, all of those were originally, sort of offshoots of philosophy, and then they attained independence and quite often promptly forgot their beginnings and succeeded in getting a lot more grants and building universities and that sort of thing. But there's always connections between them and philosophy at higher levels. And so if we talk about thinking about sociological dimensions of these worlds, like in Ursula K. Le Guin or in Frank Herbert, we might be doing philosophy and calling it sociology, or we might be doing philosophy and calling it something else. So that's only a little bit of the picture of today. I think the other thing that kind of holds back good communication between scientists and philosophers is philosophers were, in my experience, quite often suffering from both an inferiority complex with respect to the sciences, and then have a chip on their shoulder, like, well, you can do whatever physics you want. We do metaphysics. We deal with the reality. But then when they're called upon to explain what they mean, they have a hard time articulating that. And that's not going to go over very well.
Perhaps because they lack the data that science is based on.
Yeah, and there's a question of approach too. If you want to argue about like the data of global warming, for example, I certainly can't do that. I mean, I can read people's white papers and stuff like that, but I think there's only a handful of people actually qualified to talk in a scientific manner about it in the world. And I just wouldn't have the time to acquire that. I can certainly talk about ethical implications of it, but at a certain point, my competence would have to end. And I think sometimes philosophers don't want to admit that, And then on the other side, scientists sometimes don't want to respect sort of where their own training and understanding of things ends as well. So they stray over into philosophical topics. I kind of like if that happens though, because it's better if we have dialogue and we try to hash things out than just say, you stay on your side of the fence over there and don't talk across the fence, and we'll do the same thing. They usually say the same thing with literature too, right? I'm sort of trespassing on the borders of literature, right?
It seems that philosophy is more universal in that to some extent it's more people are interested in practicing it whether they're trained or not than science.
Yeah, well, there's certain issues that we examine in philosophy that if you're going to live, you can't avoid grappling with. Now, whether you explicitly call it philosophy or not, that's a whole different ballgame, right? I think it's similar. We can say similar things with the humanities too, right? You can't help but do some history because otherwise you don't know where you came from at all or what happened before. You can't help but do some literature unless you totally avoid, stories. What are other things that we could say? I mean, yeah. What's that?
She said that.
The arts, yeah.
Well, in nonfiction too, you have a certain philosophy. As you're writing this history, for instance,
Yeah.
and then you're going to look at the fact, so to speak, in that light.
Yeah.
The facts are past, and you have to give your own.
Oh, yeah.
interpretation.
Yeah, figuring out how to make sense out of what occurred in the past and the documentary evidence that we have for it. There's all sorts of really interesting questions involved in that. And there's a place where history and philosophy kind of stray into each other's pasts as well. It's funny. One great philosopher who I'm a big fan of, but who's very difficult to, because of his style, to make sense of, is this guy Hegel. And he gave lectures both on the history of philosophy and on the philosophy of history. And they're pretty close. They're pretty similar, those lectures that he gives. Any other questions or comments? Or what do you guys think about the since I have you here for a couple minutes, what do you think about the particular authors? I know there's others I could have picked, like Heinlein would have been nice to get in there. I wanted to get Lovecraft, but then I'd have to talk about horror, and I didn't really want to stray too much into that. Anne McCaffrey too. I thought about putting her in. She'd be kind of. She's one of those that strays from science fiction into fantasy quite a bit. Are these people that you've read or you like? Or?
All three of them.
Not all of them.
There's some I may want to read, so maybe
Okay.
you recommend you would be helpful to maybe.
Well, on this sheet I give you some recommended readings.
Okay, great.
Some of them are a bit more of an investment than others. Like, I mean, if you haven't read like the whole, Lord of the Rings thing, that's a pretty big investment. Even just watching the movies takes a while. It's funny too that he managed to turn The Hobbit, which is just so short, into just as long as the Lord of the Rings. And then at the very end, right, George R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire. Each one of those books is about this fat. So yeah, and they can be tough to wade through.
See, I know it.
Go ahead.
Like a follow-up with Harry Potter, some of the children.
Oh, children's literature. Yeah, that would give me a good excuse to go back and read some of the stuff that I haven't read for a long time.
Maybe you can do Harry Potter, Lemony Snicket, like there's so many that are, that kind of have that theme. We're introducing children to, I think, a very different approach using
Fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the Harry Potter stories are closely aligned with the Narnia stories. It was the same.
And I seem to remember when I was a kid that there was science fiction written for kids.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the names of any of the authors. So I remember fantasy authors who wrote for juvenile audiences, but I don't remember any of the science fiction authors. Oh, I know. One of the sets would be the Tom Swift
Just show
books.
them this.
There was this character Tom Swift and his incredible adventures. Yeah. Well, if there aren't any other questions or comments, we can bring this one to a close. And so you know when the dates are, and we may have to expand the table a little bit. We'll figure out how to do that next time if everybody shows up and if more people come. But I'm very glad all of you came. Nice January evening, and I'll see you, those of you who are here for Tolkien on February 11th.
Thank you.
Sure. You're welcome.